The moment Claire Monroe slammed the hood of her old, beat-up sedan, she knew she was in trouble. Smoke billowed from the engine, the acrid scent of burning oil filling her nostrils. She groaned, wiping her grease-streaked hands on her jeans, and looked up at the sky as if pleading for divine intervention. Need a hand. She turned to see a man standing a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his dark jeans. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and ridiculously handsome, like the kind of guy you'd see in a cologne ad. Tousled dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm good," Claire said, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Unless you've got a miracle tucked away in that fancy coat of yours." The man chuckled, stepping closer. "I might." "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated. Strangers offering help usually came with an agenda, but her car was dead and she was stranded in the middle of nowhere outside a gas station. Her pride could take a backseat for once. "Be my guest," she said, stepping aside. The man shrugged off his coat and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt before leaning over the engine. Claire watched, arms crossed, as he inspected the steaming mess. "Looks like a busted radiator hose," he said after a moment. "You're not driving this anywhere today," Claire sighed. "Great. Just what I needed. Where were you headed?" "Home. I had an interview in the city, but it didn't exactly go as planned," she exhaled sharply. "And now I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get back." The man hesitated, then offered, "I could give you a ride." Claire narrowed her eyes. "No offense, but I don't even know your name." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a smile. "Nathaniel King, but you can call me Nate." "Claire Monroe," she replied, shaking his outstretched hand. His grip was firm, warm. "Nice to meet you, Claire. Now, what do you say? I promise I'm not a serial killer." She studied him for a moment. He was too well dressed for a mechanic, too polished for a guy who just happened to be hanging around a gas station. But there was something about him, something steady, trustworthy. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "All right, Nate, but if you turn out to be a weirdo, I'm jumping out of the car." He laughed. "Fair enough." The car he led her to was sleek, black, and way too expensive to belong to a regular guy. Claire paused, eyeing it suspiciously. "This yours?" Nate nodded, unlocking the doors. "Figures," she muttered, sliding into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of leather and something distinctly masculine. As they pulled onto the highway, the silence stretched between them until Nate finally asked, "So, what was the interview for?" Claire sighed. "A marketing job." "It was a long shot, but I needed a change. Right now, I'm just working at a diner, barely scraping by." "Sounds like you've had a rough day. You have no idea." She slumped against the seat. "But that's life, right? You keep going even when it sucks." Nate glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah, you do." The rest of the ride passed in easy conversation, Claire's sarcasm, Nate's smooth wit. By the time he pulled up in front of her tiny apartment complex, she felt like she'd known him for years. "Thanks for the ride," she said, undoing her seatbelt. "Anytime," Nate replied. She hesitated, then blurted, "You should stop by the diner sometime. I owe you a cup of coffee." His smile was slow, deliberate. "I just might take you up on that." Claire stepped out, watching as he drove off. There was something about him, something different. But she had no idea just how much her life was about to change. Claire wiped down the counter at the diner, her mind drifting to the man who had given her a ride home. She hadn't expected to think about him again, but something about Nate lingered in her thoughts. Maybe it was his easy confidence, or the way he'd actually listened to her without judgment. Either way, she doubted she'd ever see him again, which was why her breath caught when the diner door swung open, and there he was. Dressed in a simple dark sweater and jeans, Nate strolled inside like he belonged there, scanning the room until his gaze landed on her. A slow, knowing smile tugged at his lips as he made his way to the counter. "Coffee," he said, sliding onto a stool. "I believe you owe me one." Claire smirked, grabbing a mug. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." I like to keep people on their toes. She poured his coffee, watching as he wrapped his hands around the mug, his fingers long and strong. There was something oddly out of place about him sitting there, like he belonged in some high-end restaurant rather than a small town diner. "So, is this your usual spot?" he asked, taking a sip. "I work here, remember?" "Right, but do you like it?" Claire exhaled, leaning against the counter. "It pays the bills, mostly." Nate studied her for a moment. "That interview, was it something you really wanted, or just a way out?" She hesitated. "Both. I've always wanted to do marketing, but doors don't exactly swing open for people like me." "People like you," she gestured around the diner. "People who don't come from money, no family connections, just trying to get by." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "And if you had the chance, would you take it?" In a heartbeat. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then Nate glanced at the menu. "What's good here?" Claire laughed. "Depends, how brave are you?" "That bad. Let's just say the coffee's the safest bet," Nate grinned. "Then I'll stick with that." He stayed longer than she expected, his presence drawing curious glances from the regulars. Something about him stood out, like he wasn't just another customer passing through. And when he left, promising to come back, Claire found herself hoping he would. Days passed, and true to his word, Nate kept showing up. Morning coffee turned into late-night conversations over pie. He asked about her dreams, her past, her frustrations, and he listened, really listened, as if her words actually mattered. Claire, in turn, found herself wanting to know more about him. But Nate was careful, revealing little about his own life. He spoke in vague terms about his work, always changing the subject when she pressed. One evening, as they sat in a booth after closing, she finally called him out. "You're a mystery, Nate. You ask all these questions about me, but I barely know anything about you." He leaned back, smirking. "Maybe I like keeping you curious." She rolled her eyes. "Come on, what do you do for a living?" "A little bit of everything." "That's not an answer," he chuckled. "Fine, business." Claire arched a brow, vague and suspicious. "Would you believe me if I said I run a small company?" "Depends how small." His lips twitched. "Smaller than some." "Bigger than others," Claire huffed. "You're impossible." "And yet you keep talking to me." She couldn't argue with that. As the days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. Claire found herself looking forward to his visits, to the quiet moments where he made her forget the weight of the world. And yet, she still had no idea who he really was. Claire's shift had just ended when she stepped out of the diner, stretching her arms with a tired sigh. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon. The quiet hum of the small town streets was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the dinner rush, and for once, she wasn't in a hurry to get home. She was halfway to her car when she spotted him. Nate stood across the street, leaning against a sleek black motorcycle. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the glint in his eyes as he watched her. "You ride now?" she asked, crossing the road toward him. He smirked. "Always have." Claire raised a skeptical brow. "Somehow I don't see you as the leather jacket, reckless speed type." "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think," he teased, tossing her a helmet. She caught it, looking between him and the bike. "What's this?" "A ride, you up for it?" She hesitated. The idea of getting on the back of a motorcycle with a man she still couldn't quite figure out was both thrilling and slightly insane. But then again, Nate had a way of making her throw logic out the window. With a small shake of her head, she secured the helmet and climbed on behind him. "Hold on," he warned. The engine roared to life beneath them, vibrating through her bones as she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. The moment he pulled onto the road, the world blurred into streaks of light and motion. The wind rushed past her, cool against her skin, and for the first time in a long while, she felt weightless. Free. They rode through the quiet backroads, past darkened fields and sleepy storefronts, until he finally slowed to a stop near an overlook. The town stretched out below, twinkling with distant lights. Claire slid off the bike, pulling off her helmet as she turned to him. "So what's this about?" Nate leaned against the bike, his expression unreadable. "You looked like you needed a break." She crossed her arms, tilting her head. "And you decided a late-night ride was the solution." "You tell me," he countered. "Are you thinking about anything else right now?" She blinked, realizing he was right. The stress, the exhaustion, the worries that usually clung to her, it was all quieter now. "Okay," she admitted. "Point taken." They stood there for a while, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Claire stole a glance at him, taking in the way he seemed more at ease out here, away from everything. "You're hard to figure out," she said finally. Nate chuckled. "That a complaint? An observation?" She studied him. "You don't talk much about yourself. You ask a lot of questions, but you keep yourself in the shadows." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I like hearing about your life more than talking about mine," Claire scoffed. "That's not an answer." He was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "There's a lot to me you don't know, Claire." She frowned. "Then tell me." He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "Not yet." A flicker of frustration sparked in her chest, but she pushed it down. Whatever he was holding back, he clearly wasn't ready to share it. Instead, she sighed and dropped onto a nearby bench. "Fine, but one day you're going to have to stop being a mystery." Nate smirked, joining her. "We'll see." They sat there, the distant hum of the world below them filling the silence. And despite the secrets still hanging between them, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she'd never felt more alive than she did in that moment, sitting beside him. Claire had always thought she was good at reading people, but Nate. He was a puzzle with missing pieces, a man who listened more than he spoke, who offered glimpses of himself without ever revealing the full picture. And yet, here he was again, waiting for her outside the diner after another long shift, leaning against that sleek black motorcycle like he had all the time in the world. "You're persistent," she said, stopping in front of him. He grinned. "And you're surprised," she shook her head, fighting back a smile. "Not anymore." Nate handed her a helmet, and she took it without hesitation this time. No questions, no second guessing, just trust. As they weaved through the empty streets, Claire pressed closer, the warmth of his body steady and sure. There was something about the way he made her feel like the world wasn't so heavy, like she could breathe easier when he was around. They didn't stop at the overlook tonight. Instead, he took her somewhere different. A private estate perched high above the city, its wrought iron gates swinging open as they approached. Claire stiffened slightly. "Where are we?" "My place," Nate said simply. She blinked. "Your place." He cut the engine and turned to face her. "I figured it was time you saw more of my world." "No more half-truths." She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, but there was only certainty, so she followed him. The house, no, the mansion was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, every inch of the space exuding quiet luxury. The kind of wealth that wasn't just money, but power, influence. Claire swallowed, taking it all in. "This is not what I expected." Nate watched her carefully. "I know." She turned to him, crossing her arms. "So let me guess, you don't run a small company, do you?" His lips twitched. "Not exactly," she exhaled, shaking her head. "You're a billionaire, aren't you?" He didn't deny it. Claire let that sink in. The expensive car, the vague answers, the way he always paid for things without hesitation, it all made sense now. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. His expression softened. "Because I didn't want it to matter. I wanted you to see me, not the money." She bit her lip, processing. She'd spent her whole life around people who judged worth by bank accounts, who assumed wealth meant happiness. But Nate, he was different. He hadn't flaunted it, hadn't tried to buy her affection. He just was, and she couldn't deny what she already knew in her heart. It didn't change the way she felt about him. Claire stepped closer, tilting her head. You know, I might have fallen for you even if you had told me. His gaze darkened, and in that moment the air between them charged with something electric. You might have, he murmured. She smirked. Okay, definitely. Nate exhaled a quiet laugh before cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing her skin like he was memorizing the feel of her. And then, finally, he closed the distance, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and utterly consuming. Claire melted into him, her fingers tangling in his shirt as the world around them blurred. For so long she'd kept her heart guarded, convinced that love was something fleeting, something that never lasted. But with him, it felt real, unshakable. When they finally pulled apart, Nate rested his forehead against hers, his voice low. You're not going anywhere, are you? She smiled, her hands still gripping his shirt. Not a chance. And for the first time in her life, Claire knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. Claire's fingers curled around the edge of the silk sheets as she sat at the edge of Nate's impossibly large bed, staring out at the city skyline through the massive windows. The morning sun cast long golden rays across the room, illuminating the elegant, modern space that screamed wealth more than anything he'd ever said. Last night had changed everything. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, feeling this way about someone. Nate had always been a mystery, but now that the truth was out, it wasn't the money that made her hesitate, it was what it meant. He was part of a world she didn't belong to, a world where people didn't struggle to pay rent or worry about stretching a paycheck until the end of the month. Would she ever fit into it? Would he ever understand what it meant to live without the kind of safety net he had? The soft sound of footsteps broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Nate standing by the doorway, barefoot, his hair slightly tousled. He looked different in the daylight, less like the untouchable man she had met that night by her broken-down car, and more like the man who had spent weeks learning every little thing about her. You're awake early, he said, his voice still husky from sleep. Claire gave him a small smile. Couldn't sleep much. Nate studied her for a moment before crossing the room and sitting beside her. You're thinking too hard. She huffed out a quiet laugh. It's kind of hard not to. He reached for her hand, his fingers tracing slow circles on her skin. Talk to me, she hesitated, searching for the right words. This, us. It's not just some casual fling, is it? His jaw tightened slightly. No, it's not, she exhaled slowly, nodding. Then what happens now? Because I don't exactly belong in your world, Nate. His grip on her hand tightened, as if he was afraid she'd slip away. Who says you have to fit into some mold? I don't care about any of that, Claire. I care about you. She turned to face him fully, emotions swirling in her chest. But I do care. Not because of the money, but because I don't ever want to feel like I'm losing myself in something I can't keep up with. Nate's expression softened, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. You're not losing anything, you're gaining me and I'm gaining you. Claire swallowed hard. That's terrifying. He let out a quiet chuckle. Yeah. It is. For a long moment, they just sat there, the city moving on beyond the glass, the world still spinning even as everything between them felt like it had shifted. Then, as if deciding something, Nate stood and held out his hand. Come with me, she hesitated. Where? You'll see. With a deep breath, she took his hand. The drive was quiet, the tension in her chest easing slightly as they left the towering buildings behind and moved toward the outskirts of the city. Nate didn't say much, but his hand stayed firm on the wheel, his other resting on the console between them, fingers occasionally brushing against hers. When they finally pulled up to a small, unassuming building, Claire frowned. It wasn't a high-end restaurant or some exclusive club. It was a community center, modest but well-kept, with kids playing outside and volunteers bustling around inside. She looked at Nate curiously. What is this? He parked the car and turned to her. Something I've been working on for a while. Come on. She followed him inside, where a group of children sat in a reading circle while volunteers sorted supplies. The walls were lined with bookshelves, art supplies, and small study cubicles. A woman in her 40s, wearing a warm smile and a volunteer badge, walked up to them. "Nate." "I was wondering when you'd stop by." Claire blinked, looking between them. Nate smiled. "Had to bring someone special." The woman turned to Claire, her expression kind. "You must be Claire." Claire's eyes widened. "You know who I am," Nate chuckled. "I talk about you." Her stomach flipped. The woman extended a hand. "I'm Alina." "Nate has been funding this center for a few years now. Keeps it off the radar, though. Doesn't like the attention." Claire turned to him, stunned. "You never mentioned this." Nate shrugged. "I don't do it for recognition." Something inside her cracked open. This man, the one who had listened to her dreams, who had never once made her feel less than, wasn't just wealthy. He was good. A lump formed in her throat as she looked around. "This is incredible." He watched her carefully. "I wanted you to see that money doesn't define me, Claire. What I do with it does." She bit her lip, emotions swirling. "You really are impossible, you know that," he smirked. "But you like me anyway." She rolled her eyes. "Unfortunately, yeah." Nate reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "Then stop worrying about whether you fit into my world." "Because my world is wherever you are." Claire exhaled slowly, the last of her doubts fading. Maybe she had been looking at it all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about fitting into his world, it was about creating something new together. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Claire stood in the center of Nate's penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was immaculate, a reflection of the man who owned its sharp edges, understated luxury, and a quiet sense of control. But tonight, something felt different. The air between them was charged, thick with emotions unspoken. Nate had shown her a side of himself she never expected, a man who gave, who cared beyond the wealth and power that surrounded him. And now, standing here, she knew there was no turning back. She turned to find him watching her, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You're thinking again," he murmured. Claire let out a soft breath. "It's a habit." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "I can see that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the city below, the distant flicker of headlights weaving through the streets. Then, finally, she asked the question that had been sitting on the edge of her mind. "What happens now, Nate?" His jaw tightened slightly, as if he had been expecting the question but still wasn't sure how to answer it. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want." Claire searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt, but all she saw was unwavering certainty. "What if I want this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "All of it, you, us." Something in his expression shifted, his shoulders loosening as if the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted. "Then you have it," he said without hesitation. Claire swallowed, emotions crashing over her all at once. "No more secrets." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "No more secrets." A slow smile tugged at her lips. "Good." Nate exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You really have no idea what you've done to me." She arched a brow. "What have I done?" His grip tightened slightly. "Made me want something I never thought I'd have." Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. "And what's that?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he cupped her face and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or desperate, it was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that wasn't just about passion but about everything unsaid, everything felt. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "Stay," he whispered. Claire closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the moment. The uncertainty, the fear, the hesitation, it was all gone. She had her answer. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.